Hello, this is going to be the review for the nervous system, which is the last part of the anatomy section we are going through. We are first going to start talking about the movement of an action potential down a neuron. And that movement of an action potential is the signals that are being sent from neuron to basically nerve cell to nerve cell, neuron to neuron. And what actually transmits a signal down a neuron is the collective work of sodium channels, which are here, and potassium channels, which are basically spread throughout the entire cell membrane of the neuron. And the most important part about a nerve cell or a neuron is that it has basically a concentration gradient difference on the inside compared to the outside of the cell. The inside of the cell is usually at its resting state going to be more negative than the outside of the cell, which is more positive. The importance of that is that having a charge discrepancy between the inside and the outside of the cell allows for, you know, basically as an action potential or chemical signals come to the neuron, they're going to offset that charge and transmit a signal down the neuron in one direction. And we'll talk about how that's done. So at the resting state, a normal neuron is going to be negative on the inside, positive on the outside, and it's going to be around, this chart shows it at about negative 75 millivolts. The basically the threshold for getting one of these neurons to fire is going to be right underneath the 50, or that negative 55 millivolts. And the importance of that is that neurons fire at an all or nothing rate. So at a normal resting state, if a neuron receives some chemical signals that offset the charge on the inside of the cell, just a little bit though, and not enough to change the electrical, basically the voltage to above negative 55 millivolts, that neuron's not going to fire. However, if the neuron receives just enough chemical signals to get above negative 55, it's going to fire the whole way. And if it receives way more than negative 55, it's still going to fire in the same fashion. So it really doesn't matter how much energy is applied to the neuron, just that there's enough to get over the negative 55 millivolt threshold to fire the action potential. So how is it that you feel senses differently or feel signals differently in neurons? Well, it has to deal with the repeating fashion of this entire process rather than really the feeling of one stimulation in a neuron. So that's really what the difference is. Within the depolarizing phase, which happens right after you get over that threshold, these sodium channels are going to open wide, basically right open, and allow sodium to basically flow into the neuron. And what that is going to do is it's going to flip the positive and negative signals on the inside and outside of the cell, transmitting a signal down the neuron. After the repolarizing phase has started to happen, this inactive gate on the sodium channel is going to close, and you're going to start seeing the change in basically concentration go back to negative and positive. And within the undershoot, which is the fourth step, the potassium channel remains open for a little longer than it should. And what potassium is going to do is, as it flows out, it's going to create more of a negative charge on the inside of the cell because you're getting rid of positive charges. And during the undershoot, it allows the segment of the neuron that just fired to not fire repeatedly, or not fire again right after, as the signal is being transmitted down the neuron. Now that's really important because if that wasn't the case, then a signal would just fire on a neuron in every direction the entire time. It wouldn't sequentially move down a neuron, which is why the undershoot is so important. So that's basically the review of how a neuron fires. You can see kind of in this picture, as one segment or one one segment of the neuron fires and goes through the first action potential, the sodium is going to run it. Basically, the sodium channels are going to open up. The sodium is going to move into that neuron, offset the charges, and that signal is going to be sent down the neuron in this direction. Following that action potential, this segment is going to do the exact same thing, and while the sodium is moving into the cell, this one is going to have basically potassium being pumped out, and the undershoot is going to be happening over here while this action potential is happening at the same time. That way the signal doesn't go backwards, it can only go in this direction. And every single time a segment of the neuron goes through its action potential, the segment that just came before it is going to be going through the undershoot, allowing it not to fire and the signal to move through the neuron. So just kind of review what the neuron actually looks like. You know, you got your cell body with dendrites hanging off the end of it to receive signals. If a neuron is receiving a signal, it's known as the the post-synaptic cell or neuron. And if it is transmitting, then it's known as the pre-synaptic cell. So as this cell receives a signal, it's going to be the postsynaptic cell because it's receiving the signal through the dendrites that are then going to move through the cell body down the axon hillock, down the axon in this fashion, just like we've talked about, all the way to the synapse where it's going to jump from one neuron to another across kind of a gap, which we'll talk about. So how do charges move throughout our body so quickly? You know, you think about a charge starting basically in your brain and going all the way down to your big toe. How are you able to get that, or how is your body able to get that charge down there so quickly? Well, it's due to a type of conduction called saltatory conduction. And what that actually allows the nerve cell to do is just transmit the signal faster, because not only is it, you know, basically running down the neuron, the charge is running down this neuron, it's skipping giant portions of the neuron, speeding up the process. So what kind of helps the nerves do that is a cell called the Schwann cell. And Schwann cells are very insulated cells that surround neurons in little tiny segments. And in between those segments are what are known as nodes of Ranvier. And those are the actual spots on the neuron where the signal's still going to be transmitted through, and the action potential is still going to happen in between the Schwann cells at those nodes. But that's only where they're going to happen. So a neuron receives a signal, goes through the cell body, and then as it approaches its first Schwann cell, instead of going through the action potential within the Schwann cell, it's going to jump to the first node. I kind of missed on jumping here. Jump to the first node, go through the action potential, and then as it moves down the cell, move just to the next node. So instead of having to fire every single segment of the neuron, you're only firing little bits of the neuron and speeding up that process altogether. So as you get down to the end of the neuron, you have all that sodium being pumped into the neuron, and as it flows down the cell, it's sent to the next neuron as a chemical signal. And basically, ion channels within the postsynaptic cell are going to open up due to these neurotransmitters. And as those open up, the sodium from the first or the presynaptic cell that was basically flowing in through those channels is going to skip neurons. It's going to go from the presynaptic cell to the postsynaptic cell. And that you got to remember, that sodium charge is the one that is basically the charge that started the process of depolarizing the neuron. So that signal now is being transmitted from one neuron to the next. And that signal will continually be transmitted as long as the sodium content remains enough to basically fire the action potential, get over that negative 55 millivolt threshold that is required. So when you think about, a nerve, you gotta remember that this picture right up here, where you have one neuron connected to another neuron, and that neuron is transmitting a signal in another direction, it's not really how neurons are connected in your body. Neurons are connected in many different ways, and as you go about learning new things, those connections are changing all the time. Your neurons don't just stay in one position constantly. And you have two different signals that your neurons receive: excitatory excitatory signals, and inhibitory signals. And those are sent by neurons, just in general, and those open up different channels within the nerve. So an excitatory synapse or signal is going to open up sodium channels, and opening up sodium channels is going to transmit a signal down a neuron and do that whole process we just talked about. However, an inhibitory signal is going to open up potassium channels, and in opening up potassium channels, you make that undershoot bigger. Okay, so without firing the neuron, you're actually making or making the charge disparity a little longer or a little larger, and the neuron is not going to fire that signal as if it was transmitting some sort of message to the next neuron. It's not going to be transmitting anything because it hasn't fired at all. You've actually lowered the amount of charge. So if I draw kind of a chart here, this was your resting state, and instead of doing this, depolarizing and the whole bit, with an inhibitory signal, you're actually going to lower the resting state, and it's going to creep back up slowly as the potassium channels close, and then those ion pumps pump sodium and potassium back to the resting state level. So those are the different types of signals that you can receive. So your central nervous system is your brain, and the brain is the place where most messages are relayed. It's kind of a meeting spot between what you're sensing and what you're doing. So your central nervous system, being your brain, is one part of your nervous system. The peripheral nervous system, however, is the other part, and that's how you interact with your environment. You have two parts of that peripheral nervous system, one being the sensory part, where you're actually sensing things on the outside in the world and things on the inside in your body that you can actually control. That's part of your sensory division of your peripheral nervous system. With your motor division, you're actually moving through your environment, and there are two parts of that. One that you can actually control. Okay, those are your muscles, so you can control this part. Sorry, I cut off there at the end. And you also have an autonomic nervous system, which is signals or movements that you can't control. And how are those done, or how are those arranged in your body? Well, they're arranged actually along your spinal cord. Your spinal cord has a particular spot where every single one of these actions is controlled. And the actions on the left are actually done with pretty low stress. Or at a normal resting state, your body is going to basically do all of these signals quite, generally, quite normally, without any real stress. The sympathetic division of your nervous system. Sorry, I think I cut it off. All of these are actually done through the fight or flight, basically through that type of reaction. So if you're in some kind of danger or going through some very intense trauma or stress, these signals will not just go from where you're sensing them to your brain and then come back. Most of the time, they'll just bounce right back. They'll go from where you sense them, so wherever nerves sense the signal, to some ganglia in your spine, and then bounce right back and perform some type of reaction that will help you hopefully survive whatever you've encountered. And now that we've actually talked about the peripheral nervous system, going back to the central nervous system, the central nervous system being your brain contains a few different parts. The basically lower portion of your brain is going to be the part of your brain that controls basically another type of autonomic system. So a system that you can't control, balance, different functions of the heart, keeping your digestive system going. Those signals are all done through some sort of autonomic reaction. The the cerebral part of your brain, which is closer to the top and kind of encompasses all of the brain on the outside, is really one that is going to be sensing a lot of things like smell and speech and hearing, and it's going to be where you manage learning and things like that. So that is going to be our review for the nervous system. If you have any questions, please talk to your teacher, and I will see you next time.